to introduce Ken Onstead, the CEO of Onstead Tree, Shrub, and Lawn Care Company. Ken has many qualifications in the tree care industry. He is a certified ISA arborist, American Society of Consulting Arborist member, and amongst many other things, has his New York and New Jersey pesticide application license. Thank you so much, Ken, for spending the time to talk about the basics of tree care.
Thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for coming today and so forth. I know when Hillary originally asked me this for condo co-op and HOA board members and so forth, I guess I figured that, you know, most of these basic concepts are going to apply to whatever sort of development that you're in or representing or on the board of possibly, or engage in making decision making, as well as your own home. So I think this will be similar in many ways. Okay, here's the agenda. So I figured, you know, right off the bat, like planting, we're going to go through a little bit of planting, what to consider planting the right tree or shrub in the right spot, soil factors and location factors that tie into that, sourcing, qualifying, and inspecting, and then the actual planting. So I think this is such a crucial point, whether you're a new development and putting in new trees, or deciding to renew the property and take out some old stuff to put new stuff in, or what you're struggling with at your locations because of possibly the wrong tree planted in the wrong spot. Maintenance a little bit of trees and shrubs, and you can kind of see those categories that we'll go through there. Some common trees and pests and some invasives, and what to look for when you're choosing some providers. And I figured maybe we'd stop after each one of those and just answer some questions along the way, if that's okay with everyone. I'm not sure where everyone comes from, but you know, HOAs and condos and HOA boards, I mean, these are kind of stock photos, although we handle hundreds of them. You know, it might be a high-rise sort of apartment building that has a courtyard or surrounding foundation shrubs or trees and parking lots, or sort of these townhouse row situations, or it might be individual homes, you know, that are part of you know, an HOA situation. So it really all depends, and they all come with their individual challenges that way. Planting of trees and shrubs. You know, I think the key point here, when you're reading through these different bullet points, is that really that if planting is a well thought out on the site, conditions and spacings and species, you know, aesthetics are taken into account, you can have a low maintenance, beautiful landscape. I feel like, you know, if you have the right tree in the right spot that is in the right sun conditions and water conditions, that you're not going to have a lot of high-end maintenance, pest control, and things along those lines. I think you have to start off with, you know, what's your objective, of planting the tree or shrub. You know, why are you planting? Purpose of the installation, the desired end result down the line. You know, what is the project? I think it's sort of 4 ways of really asking the same question here. So are you looking at new foundation shrubs or new plantings? You know, sometimes we're going to places and we're seeing that, let's say on the right over there, that there's a large Norway maple or a large deciduous shade tree, and we're always trying to plant grass underneath it. And landscapers there, you know, spreading grass seed, and it never makes it. You know, and they do that year in and year out. Maybe we have to look at an alternative. Maybe it is just a large mulch circle around that tree. Maybe it is, you know, shade tolerant perennials that can kind of grow underneath there. Now, I'm always going to be a proponent for more mulch and less turf in general. You can see where the river birches are on the left over there. You know, we're basically, mulch protects from mechanical damage, it regulates soil temperature, adds organics to the plant material. So it's always going to be a benefit to have that. You know, you're looking for a single shade tree, you know, a large shade tree, or more of an ornamental tree. You know, when you plant, you know, an oak or maple or sweet gum or tulip or any of these larger, you know, linden shade trees, you know, they grow. As arborists, when we're making recommendations for trees, we know what that thing looks like in 80, 90, 100 years. And isn't that the intention to a certain extent? You know, or is it a small ornamental tree that can grow? You'll notice that the turf on that right picture is around that tree lilac is too close. We should have a mulch circle there on both of these trees. Shrubs. Are we looking for, flowering shrubs? Are they deer resistant? Are they evergreen? What's the maintenance involved in those shrubs? Single evergreens allow spacing for the tree, like that's a Norway spruce there. And many times people are using Norway spruces as almost like a screen, and the site just isn't conducive for a large Rockefeller Christmas tree, because that's really what you're planting there. And then you're always working against the genetics of the tree that wants to be 100-foot tall with a 35, 40-foot spread. And it comes with challenges. It's never going to be a long-term planting when you're choosing trees that aren't conducive for that particular site. The right collection of plant material that works together and have similar requirements is another sort of a thing. You'll see hydrangeas planted in front of boxwoods, and hydrangeas are the first to wilt and need water, but meanwhile the boxwoods are being over irrigated if they're on the same system and close to each other. So just knowing what the requirements of the plants are when you're putting this together is very important. You have a collection of trees and shrubs. Here you have some variety, color, and some contrast. You don't have to do a monoculture of planting just to achieve a screening situation. This isn't a landscape that we maintain, but I would make the argument here even that people don't leave enough room sometimes for the evergreens. So those arborvitaes are going to compete with that cypress. If you know long-term what you're trying to achieve, you might be able to pull some things out and move some things around along those lines. But having that diversity is going to be very important. Here you have green giant arborvitaes that have become very, very popular nowadays. But they do get to be 50 to 70 foot tall with a 15 to 25-foot spread. I see these being planted sometimes way too many of them. The spacing is really not adequate to achieve long-term screening. And there's maintenance involved in green giant arborvitaes, obviously feather pruning and possibly capping off at a certain height to achieve the screening that you're looking for, sustaining the right pyramidal form so you're not losing the bottoms. So sometimes they're overplanted and we end up having to remove every other one or transplant every one to another location. So it's obviously much better than a fence, but just always consider that species and so forth, which we like, but they get big and they grow wide. Objective for planting trees and shrubs, with parking lots and border street trees. This is a big thing, I would assume, around HOAs and buildings and so forth, where you have parking lots and small islands and things of the sort. You have car exhaust and heat, radiant heat. You have salt exposures that happen in this environment. You have limited irrigation, if any, limited soil volume for the tree to actually mature in. Height clearance requirements from lights, security cameras, vehicles, facades, roofs, whatever it may be. So you really want to be thinking about urban tolerant trees in this spot. Cornell has this great site assessment checklist, and there's going to be a link over here in a few slides. But whenever you're looking at a site, this is a great place to start. What's your hardiness zone of the plant material you're looking at? What's the microclimate factors, sunlight, irrigation levels that need to be required for certain plants? It gets into soil factors with pH, the types of soils, compaction, drainage characteristics, which is rarely done, but always key. Whether the soil actually drains or percolates or not. I've had situations where we've planted a lay of trees and in new construction situations where the soil was so compacted that this tree kept on dying in this one location. And sure enough, it was just not draining away, just created like a bathtub situation. So we had to really excavate all of the soil 3 times the amount in that area in order for that tree to survive in that spot, because it was such a critical tree in a row like that. Structural factors, overhead wires, heights. So this is the the Recurb Tree website, and it's really great because it shows you small trees, medium-sized trees, large trees, what your characteristics are at that site for that location, and you can kind of like put in what you're looking for, and it narrows it down um, based upon all these various characteristics. So highly recommend the site. I probably don't use it enough. I think it's really helpful if you're looking at, okay, on a board situation, okay, what are we going to plant here? What are we going to replace here? Yeah, that's a good place to start. In HOAs and more commercial sorts of buildings, you know, you have a lot of microclimate factors, right? Like where's north, south, west, east has a lot to do with that. You know, what's the salt? Are there wind tunnels that are created there? Those are all factors and considerations. Temperature, wind, turbulence, heat balance. You know, over here to the, obviously the one to the left is, you know, a shore tree with high winds that can occur and blow things around in a building situation. I know I've been in those wind tunnels many, many times. On the right-hand side, you have a sugar maple struggling in a parking lot island. This is one of the schools we maintain. You know, all of those sugar maples really sort of failed. They just weren't adequate for that soil volume or that heat that generates off all of that asphalt. We ended up replacing some of these with honey locusts and elms, actually. Over here, sunlight levels. You know, when you're looking at planting, I think knowing what the sun requirements are for those plants is really crucial. You know, full sun is 6 hours or more. I think that kind of ties into turf a little bit too, if you're looking for that. You know, you really want that 6 hours of full sun. Knowing, you know, where the sun comes up and where it goes, and it is a really important part to choosing the plant material. I would say here too, you know, how will the landscape change over time as surrounding trees mature and light changes, right? You know, people always sometimes will say, clients will say, you know, well, it used to be great years ago here, you know, but everything grows. And I think that's sometimes lost, that landscapes change over time as things are maturing, and you might have to make alternate decisions or different decisions in those environments. I would say also, like, removal of a large failing tree has a large impact, not only on that one property, but sometimes on multiple properties where there's neighbors all the way around and light conditions change. And having maxi rhododendron under a large oak tree or understory Japanese maple, and then we remove that large oak tree, well, that maple has sun scald now, new exposure, starts to die back, the rhodos bleach out. You know, whenever I'm recommending a removal, if I have to, I'm trying to give the client an idea of what's going to occur in the future around that removal and that decision. Over here to the left in this photo, this is Amelanchier against a brick building, full sun exposure, you know, concrete walkway, filled with lace bug because of the heat exposure. It's just the wrong plant for the wrong spot. Irrigation levels, you know, there's a lot of, I see a lot of issues in the landscape with irrigation. Too much, maybe not enough, drainage, you know, where do those drains go to? Where are the low spots? I think, you know, when we're looking at irrigation, sometimes we're looking at establishment period versus maturity periods. On that point, you know, many times I'm recommending, hey, listen, we need drip here or irrigation for about maybe 3 years for establishment, but then after that, we could pretty much remove it or take it away or really, really reduce it in that manner. So maintaining that and doing like a review of your irrigation and how it works with the landscape, I think, is critical. I do a lot of that consulting for clients that way. Also, new landscape requirements levels versus mature existing when combining. Sometimes you have irrigation that's set up for an old landscape, and then you're putting in parts of it new, or vice versa. And so it has to be sort of tweaked that way to really be conducive to the plants that you're planting. Choosing and picking stock. I would say, what can that location accept? Once again, knowing for the right tree for the right spot, what's going to grow well in that area. What are the available species to plant in this location? I think once you go through the process of looking at that, your species might be a little bit limited. If you have a small little parking lot island, like what's going to make it there? Maybe a tree lilac, maybe a styrex, maybe a hawthorn. It's just a smaller volume. Maybe a zelkova. You have to go through that list once again. I think is important, and look around. What's currently thriving? What's doing well in that spot, that area is also something we completely always need to be looking at. Planting trees and shrubs, species diversity. Really important here is that, species diversity is a critical element of ecology, sustainability, the most urgent of which is to minimize the impact of pests and disease outbreaks on urban canopy cover. Everyone knows about like Dutch elm disease, and now is realizing emerald ash borer and these other sort of invasive pests that come in and how they can devastate and destroy all of the trees in one fell swoop. Asian longhorn beetle being another one. When you choose trees and diversity and so forth, you see we have all these different forms of canopy shape. We can kind of match canopy shapes by still mixing up the species that we have there. They all don't need to be one particular monoculture. This picture at the bottom right is a school I just went to the other day, and they must have, I don't know, 45 Bradford pears, all the same age, all the way around. They're starting to fail. They have codominant stems and they're splitting apart. And it's going to be a major undertaking to sort of maintain them as long as you can, but eventually they're going to have to be replaced. Ash trees and even Norway maples that they planted 40, 50 years ago a lot in our villages are all failing at the same time. Knowing the size of the tree. I think this is sometimes lost, sometimes even with, designers and landscape architects a little bit. Everything looks great on paper with a small little circle, but I think arborists have a really good idea of what these things look like in maturity and the space and requirements that they need, especially height requirements, and just kind of list some of the trees and how large they get along those lines. Planting, how much soil is needed to grow a tree. This is really important too. I mean, New York City right now, they require for the Parks Department, any small tree pits that were 3x3 before in the past, or 4x4, now 5x10. And if you look at that, I think this is such a key thing for me, especially in HOAs and buildings and environments, especially. Less of a factor, I guess, on homeowner properties, but still a factor. And I think this example here of a 16-inch diameter tree with a 35-foot canopy requires 1,000 cubic feet of soil. So a 15 by 15 pit, 5 feet deep, is about 1,125 cubic feet of soil. So that, a 16-inch tree isn't that really large of a tree, and you can see where that requirement is. Trees become, root bound eventually and just start to fail because they just don't have enough soil volume to sustain them. Another thing, I wanted to mention that on that diversity point, actually, I'm just looking at a note, is that, I have a condominium right now that planted, golden rain trees years and years ago. And every one of the islands has these large, beautiful golden rain trees in these pits or these islands. And I guess when they go to seed, they have starling birds that come, and they're doing their business on all of the cars through the entire parking lot and complex. So everyone, half the people that live there love the trees, the other half, because they have cars underneath them, don't. But that's part of that diversity situation. pH, obviously taking soil sample tests and so forth before you start going and planting, I think is always a wise recommendation to see where things are. Sometimes you're very much surprised on what that is. We do have in general some more of acidic soils in our general area, but it can vary. So why not, for $25, get a soil pH test and see where that is. Here you have, once again, when the pH is out of range, is a school we maintain, a red maple that I planted during a construction process. Make the argument that the tree is too close to the retaining wall, too close to the building. But you can see how it's veined out and is probably out of range on the pH level and not able to take up manganese. Checking out the soil, I think, is very, very important, and the type of soil that you have. Ideal soil texture, has 25% water and 25% air. So really half of it's water and air. That's a good soil. When soils get compacted, they go anaerobic, which is an issue with soil compaction. You want to make sure that they sort of drain well. I mean, sandy soils drain well, but they have really low organic content and biology. Clay soils hold on to a lot of nutrients, and a lot of nurseries, like in southern New Jersey, you'll see a lot of these root balls come and they're all clay soils because they hold a lot of nutrients, but they compact easily and they don't drain very well. Loam soil in our area is probably the best and what you're sort of looking for there. Sometimes you have to look what that soil is, and sometimes you have to amend it. Bringing in compost and so forth, and sand sometimes actually will do well along those lines. Draining characteristics, look, if you see if the soil smells like alcohol, it's not draining and it's anaerobic and not doing well. If it's like white mottled soil like this, PED, that's not doing well and not draining well along those lines. That percolation test that we talked about back on that Cornell site talks about, the amount of inches and within an 8-hour period and how it should drain. Also look for the topography a lot of times where things drain, right? So if, many times on these properties, things are draining there and then the water just sits in that spot and then those trees are sort of failing, and or we know that situation happens there. So what are we're gonna choose, maybe weeping willow, maybe black gum, maybe river birches, other things that can kind of maintain those areas where everything does run off that way. Soil runoff and drainage in regards to soil factors. I think this is more of a salt. I think there's a typo here on this and so forth, but just consider where the salt spray is going. Consider using sand or magnesium chloride rather than salt. Salt's just going to really damage those plants in that manner. Public safety. You have, when you're choosing trees and shrubs, definitely think about if there's a fruit and the environment that it's in. A lot of HOAs and buildings obviously have a lot of walkways and awnings and parking lots. I don't know how many times that I'm being approached to remove an oak that's dropping acorns on cars and denting it, year in and year out, or sweet gum balls that are clogging up things along those lines. And I think that if you look about the environment of what's there, first of all, you'll choose the right species, knowing what that leaf litter is going to be, or what those balls are going to be, or fruit is going to be for those particular trees. I'd argue with the public safety thing in here is that probably planting trees where they're raising up sidewalks is probably a larger issue here. And then you get into a situation where you really can't do much. You can sometimes shave down those sidewalks, or you can mound over or reconstruct it, but you really don't want to damage a root or cut a root greater than 1 inch in diameter when you're doing that. So it causes a conflict. Planting the right tree in the right spot would have avoided the raising of the sidewalk and that issue from the start. Selecting trees and shrubs, this is whether I don't know if in an HOA standpoint, you're actually out in the nursery tagging things. I doubt it. It's just more of an education to see, what you're looking for and what ends up getting brought there to be planted, and just having some general knowledge, I think, more than anything. Trunk and branch characteristics. You want to make sure that there's good vigor and growth. The branches are spaced out very well and have good attachments. The crown should be free of wounds and no evidence of insects or disease. You want to avoid heavy tree implants that have been headed back. Sometimes the growers are heading back and cutting back and topping these trees to get a bigger height or just to spurt growth. I'd probably stay away from those. Trunk should be straight and free of wounds and diseases with proper taper in the trunk. Foliage should be good if it's actually in foliage at that time of year. Good color, not burned out or scorched. That's showing that the tree didn't get adequate water or has water stress. The size of the root ball is adequate for the size. So like a 2-inch to 2.5-inch size caliper tree really should have like a 24-inch root ball. I'll tell you a quick little story of a large school that we had done, and we're in charge of the trees coming in and planting these trees in LA, and they were all oaks from down south. And the nursery wanted to fit as many trees as they possibly could on that tractor trailer. So they cut 24-inch root balls for 4-inch caliper trees. And sure enough, we documented everything along those lines, and they all ended up pretty much dying. We had to replace all of them, and all of those trees ended up being free, unfortunately, for everyone. But having the right size root ball for the right size caliper tree is very important. Also, if you're dealing with container plants, make sure that you're scouring those roots, taking them out, making sure you're cutting the outsides of those potted plants, because they typically have many girdling roots that cause that way. Which brings us a little bit to girdling roots. These are all sort of man-made. Trees are putting into a pot and into a bigger pot and into a bigger pot, and then sometimes putting into the field. You always want to basically take off as much of that soil, especially the top around the trunk flares, to inspect for girdling roots and cut and remove them, at that time. You can typically see as an arborist, when you're looking at trees and wondering whether there's a girdling root, the top main stem at the very top of the tree is usually the first part that starts to die and thin and die back. And you can kind of see it from 100 yards away. Girdling roots and canopies of trees at certain times of the year. Root growth versus top growth. This is a great example of just, unless you have some reason for an instant impact, I would always recommend going with a smaller tree. The same tree in size in 13 years. So here, I'm sorry. Year 5, so let's say year 5, if you're planting a 4-inch caliper tree, you have 103 or 100% back of the root system. If you planted a 10-inch caliper tree, it takes basically 13 years to get back 100% of the root system. And you can make the argument, obviously, above that has 674% of root growth in that area, that the tree above is going to do much better long term. For 5 years, the 4-inch tree is 100% of root system, where it takes 13 years for the 10-inch tree. So, typically we're planting 2.5-inch caliber, really 3.5-inch caliber, sometimes 4 or greater, all depends. But I would start with that smaller size whenever possible. The price is going to be better for you as well. Planting holes, when you start to see this happening, maybe the hole ideally would be 2 to 3 times the diameter of the root ball. Sometimes that's possible. Avoid planting when soil is wet. That makes a mess and the balls get destroyed, and it doesn't go well when everything is saturated that way. When planting on slopes, set the tree so the topmost part of the root ball is on the uphill side and about even with the soil. So you're usually mounding now the bottom of that root ball to sustain that soil there. Also, when you have these trees coming, there's sometimes 2 to could be even 12 inches of soil that's on top of the root ball that you're going to want to take off to expose the trunk flares at the time of planting. Even if you see all these adventitious secondary roots that are starting to get produced because the soil was against the stem, you're going to want to cut those roots and take it back to where those trunk flares are exposed in order to plant the tree at the right height. Root ball coverings, there's always a controversy going back and forth of what to remove and so forth. We pretty much remove everything. We take all the burlap and the twine off. We take off all of the wire baskets and so forth. I've seen materials and tree removals sometimes 15, 20 years later that looks like regular burlap and just sitting underneath there for whatever reason. It just went anaerobic in that spot. So we usually at least 2/3 should be removed, and all of it if possible once the tree is set in the hole. Placing the tree in the hole, you know, when you're managing rootstock and trees and so forth, you really don't want to manhandle the stem. You know, once you make that break and connection between the root ball and the stem itself, it really damages it and typically dies. You know, planting things at the right height, very important. You know, compacting it, but not over compacting it. Obviously, no more excess soil on top of the trunk flares. You want those to be exposed that way. You know, yeah, we talked about that. Adventitious roots, removing those. You can have a little well sometimes around, but you're going to remove that fairly quickly. Here's sort of a tree planted properly. You know, as far as staking goes, sometimes I try not to stake unless the situation calls for it. Maybe it's a smaller size tree. Maybe it's more of an urban environment. Maybe it's a street tree where we have to, or parking lot for the first year or two. But after that, it's got to go. You're not going to get that taper in the stem or in the branches by having that false support there. You want the tree to adapt to the conditions that it's being planted at and build up those cell walls for that. You see the burlap there cut in the bottom, a little bit of mulch, clearance from the trunk flares. So planting is at the right height is a very important. We're always correcting that, unfortunately, in the field. Post-planting, irrigate the plants as frequently as necessary to keep the root balls moist but not too wet. You know, maintain a 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch. I'd like to see a trunk flare or a root flare in this photo, but to give you a general concept of what that should look like. Much better than having the turf up there as well, right, with the damage. If you have to do some pruning and you feel like you're not going to get back to the tree at a certain time, then you can do this structural pruning here now for the tree. Hey, Hillary, I was wondering if anyone has any questions. I have a little note here. If there's any questions asked about this previous section we just went through, we could take a question or two, or we can continue on. What do you think? I don't know if you could hear me.
I was muted, so I heard you, but you didn't hear me. If anyone has any questions, I don't see any, but feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A. We'll see if any pop up. I'll give it another few seconds. I am not seeing any, but you know, if anyone has anything, feel free to throw it in the chat or the Q&A, and we can always ask next time around.
Okay, great. So next section just kind of talks about pruning, and with some just basic stuff along these lines. Pruning of young trees, I think, is really a fantastic thing, and really what you want to do when those trees are young. You're not if trees are going to tolerate pruning of live branches, it's when they're young like this. Having the correct spacing of the branches up and down the main stem, training for a terminal leader in the tree, correcting those sorts of things when the trees are young are going to prevent many times failures years later that could have been prevented when the trees were young. Pruning young trees, just kind of an example over here on the right hand side of the branch collar that you never, or the branch bark ridge, you never want to damage that, make that cut there. That's going to cause irreparable damage on that tree in some situations, but that's where those cuts should be being made. The picture on the left just showing, you know, where the main scaffolding branching should be, where you don't have too many branches all emanating out of the same place on the trunk with codominant stems. It's a place for future failure on that. The best time to prune, it's always a question that does get asked from time to time. It really all depends upon the plant material and the species, and what the objective is. I do like to plant in that sort of March, February, March, right before everything, the sugars start running for compartmentalization of the wounds that you're making. If you make those wounds earlier, let's say in the fall, sometimes the tree's not going to have the availability to seal over those wounds until the spring. So why not wait a little bit longer? Elms, you're not going to prune besides maybe from November to March, that time period. Oaks, I prefer that time. Evergreens, some evergreens have very little pruning to do, like pines and spruces, where arborvitae might have a lot. But you can remove dead or broken branches, anytime of the year. Pruning for structure, once again, just kind of talking about, a young and a medium and a older mature tree. You see that person standing over there. If you look at some of these young trees that we're planting, are 2.5, 3 inch, 3.5 inch, all of the branches on that tree, for all intents and purposes, are temporary branching. Right? When the tree's mature, none of those branches will be there. Your first scaffolding branch on the tree will be much higher, typically. Just to consider when you're trying to raise trees for clearance and so forth. Some of these terms just you'll see on specifications that arborists will write for scope is pruning to clean. You're removing broken branches and inferior water sprouts, crossing branches. Very important to maintain good health and vigor and proper structure. Pruning to raise, and once again, HOA environments and buildings that have this, you're raising trees quite a bit sometimes for clearance issues from pathways and walkways and facades that way. Just an example. Vista pruning. Sometimes we have clients that have buildings up and down in the Riverdale section of the Bronx that all have the Palisades over there, and we try to basically contend and do various vista pruning to do some clearance. But it has to be smart, and you're not going to make everyone happy on a 13 to 14 story building where the trees cap out at 9. Like, you have to consider what floors are probably maybe sometimes get that benefit and sometimes may not. Picture bottom right is picture of Wave Hill, looking at the George Washington Bridge. They actually had a little grant to keep that vista open from one of the main houses on the property. Retrenchment pruning, this gets into more of large tree pruning. Naturally, trees that mature naturally retrench or die back and decrease in size and mass as they get older. In certain situations where we have very large mature trees, and we're looking to reduce risk, we get into a little bit of retrenchment pruning or branch end thinning to bring down and in the canopy, or branches that are overextending the natural crown that are more liable to split or break. We're taking those branch ends and we're bringing them in with cuts that don't need to be that large of size cuts. So a great part here is this subordination cut. They've proven that basically reducing a branch by 15% at the end increases the stability by 50%. So you don't have to do a lot of pruning to improve structure and stability. Pruning shrubs, timing is important. Sometimes people are saying, why aren't these things blooming? Well, they pruned off all the buds at the wrong time. Along those lines, making the right cut is really important. I'm always encouraging everyone to prune with the natural habit that the plant has, instead of making them into balls and shearing. We'll talk about that a little bit. Natural pruning, you're hiding the maintenance cut. You're just taking that longer one out and you're going into the plant and making that hand pruning cut. Severe rejuvenation pruning, where I like to do it in a third, a third, and a third. Let's say we have an older landscape that's just overbearing over whatever foundation shrubs that are there or in the front of the house. You can sustain those shrubs, but you want to take them down over time, in my opinion. Formal hedges to be wider at the bottom than the top. I think this is one of the most common things you see out there, where all the bottoms of the plants are dying because the angle is inverted. It should be wider at the bottom and more narrow at top. And you get sort of a hollow shrub or dying shrub in the middle. Reasons for pruning: maintain plant and health and appearance, training young plants for their natural form, increasing flower and fruiting, prevent injury to people and property, open a vista, rejuvenation old shrubs, we sort of talked about there. Accentuate natural features. You might have like an old hue that is too big for the spot, but you can make it into a tree-like form and remove the lower branches. That's common. This is a picture, pruning to shearing. This is like just a picture I took, like, I don't know, last Saturday at a school where you have all these sort of invasive honeysuckles, and they look sort of natural to a certain extent, but then if we're just shearing them, we're losing all that interior growth and they just look like bald and you're getting a hollow shrub. I'll show you this also here. So that's what I was talking about as far as getting the right angle. If you have boxwoods in this situation, or maybe taxus in this situation, or it could even be arborvitaes or Leland cypress. You always want to have the bottoms be wider than the tops to sustain the sunlight to the bottom and just to sustain that screen. It could be more of an informal hedge where maybe you have viburnum or witch hazel or amelanchier mixed in. This is just a quick example of someone here in Rye that had all these Ilex glabra planted in the front, and the landscaper is shearing the top, which creates this thick, dense heading cuts and a dense shelf of growth on the top. So there isn't any growth or sunlight penetrating the bottom of the plant. You'll see on the right, we've replaced like 18 of them, but then we took the entire top off of the ilex hedge, which is probably, I don't know, 90 feet long, to now expose and get sunlight and air penetration to the bottoms of the plant, which will then rejuvenate, and we'll be able to just maintain that from a natural standpoint now, instead of shearing it. This is commonly done with privet quite a bit too, but all plants, once you shear them that way, you sort of lose that interior growth. This is just an example. We have like 4 pruning cycles that we look at when we're doing a client's property that wants to utilize us for that particular service. That sometimes we're only doing one of these. If the property really only needs one heavy pruning cycle, it's usually that early summer, that late June, July, when growth has come out and is hardened off. You have a lot of perennials and things along those lines. Well, maybe you have to do things in the fall there and early spring to prep as well. It all depends upon the level of maintenance that you're doing. But I think if you're doing it right, 1 or 2 of these is usually enough, in my opinion. If there isn't any questions here, I'll just move on to talk about some tree preservation items.
I do not see any.
Okay. So just once again,
just like that, we got one.
there you go.
Oh, this person is asking a little bit more about rejuvenation pruning.
Yes. So let's say if you have large andromedas or rhododendrons or in front of a house, and they've covered the front window on the first floor, and they're 10 feet tall, and they just don't, instead of pulling them all out and starting fresh, sometimes what we'll look at doing is we'll take like a third of those and we'll take a third of the top down into the interior. And now what's happening is you have all these dormant buds there that are now getting sunlight, and now they start to grow out. And then we'll actually come back a year later and we'll do like another third as you're getting that growth down. So you can sort of rejuvenate and reduce in size and size by making those selective thinning cuts and reduction cuts in order to then stimulate. It all depends upon the species, like Taxus or Hughes. Sometimes you can go all back to bare wood and just let it. And I tell clients it's going to take 3 years to get this back to what this is at the height that you want it. And some people can tolerate that, and some people cannot. It really all depends upon the situation and your tolerance to that sort of harsh pruning. But I don't think it needs to be harsh if you're doing the right hand pruning, thinning, reduction cuts in order to stimulate interior growth. Hope that answers that question. Cabling and bracing. This is an approved ANSI practice and best management practice and so forth. So don't let anyone ever tell you, oh, if you put a cable in, you're opening yourself up to a liability because you've identified a defect. This is a practice that supports trees and gives additional supports to trees that have weak stems or codominant stems in them. So when needed, put cables in. A lot of that stuff could have been corrected when the tree was young with the right pruning, but sometimes you need to have a cable support there. Decay and cavities. We do tree risk assessments and so forth, where sometimes we're drilling trees and probing trees and looking at trees. I know when I did my track tree risk assessment course, I ended up removing many less trees along those lines. Sometimes these trees with cavities could be even stronger, believe it or not, because they're sending sugars there to reinforce the area where the cavity is. So just because a tree has a cavity doesn't mean it needs to go anywhere. Also, just looking at the biology of the tree versus the structure of the tree. When you're looking at a tree, you're really looking at two trees. You're looking at the biological or symplast part of the tree versus the mechanical or the apoplast part of the tree. So they're interconnected, obviously, but sort of two different trees. A tree could be riddled with cavities and have an inch of growth around the base of it and still have a full flush and canopy of leaves. We use, forms here, tree risk assessment forms that take you through the target analysis and, the occupancy of those targets, characteristics of the tree in order to basically get a risk rating. We might have to do aerial climbing into the tree to see if there's issues there, or drilling and level 3 resistograph or tomography analysis to see how hollow the tree is, let's just say, or if there's root rot. This is just an example of like a resistograph that shows, the needle speed and the resistance. This is all solid wood here. If it wasn't, it would drop down and show that area that is decayed and hollow. You might be able to have to do one drill, or you might have to do several drills. It really all depends. This is an example of other technology of tomography. This is an elm tree on Governor's Island that we inject for Dutch elm disease. And this was Professor Robert Merrill at the University of Connecticut that was doing an analysis to see if you were injecting these trees over years for Dutch elm disease, were those wounds creating decay in the tree by maintaining them in that way. And turns out, no, the trees were fine, and they compartmentalized those wounds, and it wasn't an issue at all long term. Once again, just kind of showing, in the middle there, you have, sometimes you have incipient rot or open cavities or decay that's starting in the tree. And this technology is pretty cool. It'll show you graphically how things look and whether the tree's conducting water there in the bottom especially is what that's telling you. Tree removals. Try not to remove trees, but every now and then the trees, in order to sustain other parts of the landscape and so forth, the tree needs to come down. If it's a hazard or a high risk, it needs to come down. Trees with EAB or BLD, that's emerald ash borer, bacteria leaf scorch on the end, beech leaf disease, which we'll talk about in a second, Dutch elm disease. just understand, once again, I mentioned it before, when you're removing a large tree, it really does have a large impact around the surrounding area. Try to preserve and retrench and reduce whenever you can. The benefits of large trees obviously outweighs many, many things along those lines. Trees, there's benefits that you can kind of quantify on trees that size. Stump grinding, I think someone had a question about stump grinding, about, can you plant a tree in the spot where you grind the stump? I mean, when we do like Parks Department planting for New York City, you have to take out the entire stump and grind the stump 24 inches down to accommodate a new tree. So it all depends upon the depth. You can excavate or grind down enough of a stump in order to plant the tree in that spot. You want to amend the soil, obviously, and not leave all shavings and take everything away, but that's possible to do along those lines. Volcano mulching, there was a thing about volcano mulching. I mean, I'm hoping, I still see it. Maybe not daily, but probably once a week, that just things are over mulched. And what ends up happening is that, that bark on the tree cannot turn into, root. So that extra moisture that's on the base of the tree basically ends up rotting and causing a basal trunk rot, and rots the base of the tree, and the tree just starts to decline that way. Or it's pushing out adventitious or a secondary root system in that area, or causing girdling roots as well. So you never want to see this. You want to see that trunk flare exposed in the landscape. Make nice flat mulch circles all the way out. Sometimes when we're coming onto landscapes and this had been done and trees are all buried and there's girdling roots every which way, or the trees are failing due to compaction, we utilize an air spade many times. And so this is called a root collar excavation for us. And we expose the trunk flares of the tree that we didn't see in that situation, and then assess girdling roots, and we cut the girdling roots. Sometimes the roots are so mature you really can't cut them. Sometimes we'll make a notch and then come back years later or make another notch just to start to slow down the growth of that particular root. But it takes a little bit of practice for this to occur. But many, many times, unfortunately, plant material is planted too deep, and this occurs and needs to be corrected that way. Ideally, in the beginning, I guess if you're maintaining a property, it's always great to have a tree inventory that way, where you have species, diameter, condition of the tree, and then plotted. Very helpful to maintain a population of trees when you have this technology and you can sort of manage it, that way. There's some free stuff online with iTrees and that you can actually utilize as well. We have a program called Tree Plotter that we utilize. It's just an example of Weave Hill, and we'll go there and get GIS markings of exactly where the tree is, take all those various characteristics, and then whenever we touch the tree, we're recording that data of what we fertilized, if we pruned. Does it have mushroom conchs or fruiting bodies at the base? What's the overall health and condition? Is there a cable in the tree? Is there an insect or pest or disease that we're maintaining? And we can sort of track all of that along those lines. So that's very helpful if you have that technology. Common tree pests in our area. I just quickly, we sort of just threw something together here showing, anthracnose is a common one. Boxwood leaf miner is very, very common. White prunicoda scale, very common on cherries and plums. I think everyone saw purple plums. Every purple plum that you probably saw this year or in the last 2 years has, black knot and is being removed or topped, or that disease in particular was out of control on purple plums. I don't know how many I've removed in the last year, but it's a lot. So environment has a lot to do with that. Tree mites, very sort of common, called stippling. Lace bug damage. Usually lace bugs are happening on plants because they're planted in the wrong spot. It's an Andromeda against the the brick and it's too hot and reflective, and lace bugs love that, or maybe the Andromeda is being sheared and it's a beautiful cover for all these pests to explode in. Cedar arborist and apple scab, those are fungicide situations where you want to treat the tree at bud break, 14 to 20 days after, somewhat timing there. Sometimes, if you're not maintaining that, all the crab apples and apple trees in the middle of summer are defoliating, and everyone's sort of wondering why. This is a preventative situation. Aphids, if they're dropping, sap all over their cars or walkways or awnings, just be aware of that situation. Conchs and fruiting bodies, if there's mushroom conchs coming out of the tree any which way, that is something that you definitely want to have a certified arborist out there taking a look at and seeing what's going on. Most of those are going to lead to a root rot or a decay situation that you want to take a closer look at. Boxwood blight, has been around, but new in our area to a certain extent, and is really sort of, killing things. It is misdiagnosed, I think, a lot of times because of other sort of irrigation issues and so forth. So you just want to be aware of that. You want to dispose of these properly and get them out of there. Invasive tree pests in our area, emerald ash borer is the thing that we're contending with right now in our area. 80, 90, 100 million ash trees have died. We're injecting them, and if the tree is in good shape, it's one that we want to keep, we're injecting them with triage every 2 years and maintaining them, and they're doing just fine. So, but if the tree isn't in great shape and has a lot of issues, maybe it's better off being removed. Spotted lanternfly, I think we're all going to see this coming year and so forth. Really heavy in Pennsylvania, I guess, is now in our area. I've not, haven't come across it yet, but I expect it here. Oak wilt, sort of new to our area, really not prevalent as of now, thank goodness. But keeping an eye on that. Bacterial leaf scorch is something that was really more south and now is more in our area, which we're finding, and is a little bit of a bigger issue with pin oak and red oak. Asian horned beetle, thank goodness, is really not prolific in our standpoint. They've lifted a lot of the restrictions of moving plant material because of it in our area. Beech leaf disease, this is a really tough one. This is now in our area, started in Ohio 10 years ago. Invasive nematode, they're still really trying to figure out many parts of it, how it moves and the damages it does, but large mature beech trees within 6 to 10 years are dying. There's some experimental treatments starting to occur, but we're really waiting for the science to catch up on it. This is American beech and European beech. European beech, traditionally, you had Phytophthora citricola and bleeding canker and those issues, but now you have this, and then American beeches that were pretty pest-free now have this. So it's a whole nother large situation and an unfortunate one. We'll have to see where it all goes. Dutch elm disease on amazing elms. I always scratch my head when I see elms die unnecessarily because they're not being injected. You inject them every 2 years, you can pretty much sustain them for a very, very long time. We do this through all of the fibrils for New York City Parks Department, Central Park, and places like that, and we maintain these groves really well by doing that. We're also using another product called Dutch Trig, which is new, and that's a verticillium wilt that you're injecting into the tree that causes the tree's natural defense system to ward off the elm disease, the Dutch elm disease, and we're doing that in the Manhattan part of Fort Tryon over there. So that's a new technology that's helping elms. What to look for in a tree care provider. This is the last slide here. Years in business and referrals from other clients, I think, is really important. Do they have certified arborists on staff? If they're outsourcing that, maybe not something you want to get involved with because of turnover. Do they provide periodic inspections? I think every property that you would consider an active client should have an annual inspection, just to walk around and just to look at hazards and scope. I think that's important for the company to be proactive with, or scheduling that with your arborist. Equipment, what do they have? Are they licensed? Their years of experience, what's included in their jobs and so forth. A full service provider. Obviously, liability insurance, getting certificates of insurance to make sure that they're covered for the type of work that they're doing on your property is very important, obviously. We're TCIA accredited, that's sort of like, a certification that they do every 3 years, that we have all of these qualifications in place that make us as the most professional company we possibly can be in that way. So I'm done with this. I don't know if anyone has any questions at the tail end here.